Well, hey everybody, Pastor Steve with you. It's Thursday, and our New Testament reading plan calls for us to be in the book of Ephesians, chapter 3. And by the way, Ephesians is a great book. I hope you're enjoying reading it. I know I am. And, I mentioned previously that Paul was in prison as he writes this, and even in chapter 3 verse 1 he calls himself the prisoner of Christ Jesus for your sake, referring to the Gentiles. And then in that same chapter in verse 13 he says, therefore I ask you not to lose heart at my tribulations on your behalf. I mentioned the other day that Paul remained positive even though he was in prison, and so he's saying, hey, don't y'all get down about it either. And then in chapter 4, verse 1, again, he refers to himself as a prisoner of the Lord. So Paul is in jail when he writes this letter. And what stood out to me, in addition to what we said the other day about Paul being positive, was how he felt about his ministry, how he saw his calling and his duty before the Lord. And so if you would look at verses 7 and 8 of chapter 3, so Ephesians 3, verses 7 and 8, he says, referring to the gospel of Jesus Christ, of which I was made a minister according to the gift of God's grace, which was given to me according to the working of his power. To me, the very least of all saints, this grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unfathomable riches of Christ. Now, in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Corinthians, spiritual gifts are literally grace gifts because they're connected with that word, gifts of the Spirit and gifts of grace. Here, Paul says the very fact that God had called him to be a minister of the gospel, a preacher, and take the gospel to the Gentiles was a gift. It was an act of God's grace. Wow. Paul considered being in ministry a sign of God's love, God's grace, a gift from God. He considered sharing the gospel with lost people an act of grace, that God had given him the privilege. God had graced him. God had gifted him with the privilege of being a minister of the gospel, with the privilege of sharing the gospel with lost people. Wow. And he felt that way even though he was in prison. Now let me ask a question. How do we feel? How do I feel? How do you feel about God's call on our lives when his will requires us to sacrifice? When his will requires us maybe to give up something, to suffer a little bit? Do we consider that a gift from God? Paul said it was a privilege for him to be able to serve Jesus this way. And sometimes I think we as Christians can lose sight of the privilege that is ours to serve Jesus. To serve him in ways that sometimes is taxing, that is tiring, that sometimes requires sacrifice and inconvenience. Paul said it was a grace gift of God that he got to do that. And we need to feel the same way. And then also, how do we feel about evangelism? Paul here felt it was a gift of God. It was an expression of God's grace to him personally, that God gave him this beautiful gift, that he had the privilege of sharing the gospel with lost people. Do we view that as a privilege, or do we view that as a burden? Wow, can you imagine how happier we would be if we had the attitude Paul had? Can you imagine how much more effective our ministries would be, we would be, our churches would be, if we had this kind of attitude that Paul had, that saw every opportunity to serve Jesus and every opportunity to share the gospel with a lost person as a privilege, as a grace gift from God? I hope you will grow in your ability to feel that way about it. And by the way, Sunday is coming up, so it's an opportunity for you to invite somebody who's lost and doesn't go to church to worship. You can invite them to worship with us on campus. We have 2 services at 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock. We also have our online services so they can watch us on YouTube, our First Baptist Church Rock Hill YouTube channel, on Facebook. All of the social media platforms will link them there. And so you can invite people to come with you to our own campus services. You can invite people to worship with us online. So you're that one lost person you're praying for, that relative, that neighbor, that family member who lives on the other side of the country, that person who lives down the street from you, that coworker. You could do the work of an evangelist and see that the opportunity you have to invite them to worship Jesus with us is a gift from God to you to get the privilege of doing that. I hope you'll feel about it that way and do something. Oh, and by the way, remember, our city council has mandated that we wear these face masks in public within the city limits of Rock Hill. So we will be wearing these. We will be wearing these when you enter, when you exit the building, and when we sing our worship song. So everybody bring your mask with you on campus, and we have some available. If you don't, we're going to be in compliance with our city ordinance. So God bless you. Hey, look forward to wrapping this up with you, this week up with you tomorrow as we look at Ephesians chapter 4. God bless you. I'll see you then.